Hey Matthew, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Angela?
I'm good, thanks. So, explain to me this. You are a theater without a theater. How does how
Yeah,
does how does that work?
that's a great question. So yes, disclaimer, American Legacy Theater is the name of our organization. And I would say that's a nuanced answer to a nuanced question, actually. There's a few things behind it. One, we're American Legacy Theater, THEATRE versus ER. And sometimes people view that as something that is, oh, well, it's the American spelling versus the international spelling. And that's one thing. The other reality is that theater with an RE is the art form, and ER is a physical space. So if we were American Legacy Theater ER without a physical space, I'm with you. That makes no sense. But we're saying, hey, we're here as the American Legacy art form, and therefore we don't need a physical space. I would also say the component behind that is if you really look at what makes theater theater, one of the best definitions I ever heard was actually from one of my closest mentors, Dr. Kaz Braun, who said theater is a two-way communication between audience and actor with artistic intent. And so, really, as long as there's an actor and there's an audience and there's artistic intent, there's nothing in the definition about physical space, about lights, sound, any of that. The two most critical components to make theater the art form is your actors and your audience, and that can happen anywhere. And in our space of trying to meet people where they're at, we do that quite literally, both emotionally and geographically. As we will go leveraging found spaces, utilizing physical place that is outside of a traditional four walls of a theater.
Okay, so in my limited understanding of how the arts work, typically theaters, well, presenting theaters,
Yeah.
so Broadway, theaters that are just they bring in acts. I think 90% of their budgets are reliant on ticket sales. I would imagine that a producing theater, their ticket sale reliant, don't quote me, but you probably know better, is maybe half or 40% of their budget. So
Yeah, I
how do
think
you,
40% on the low end.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So how do you survive if you don't have a theater space that you're selling tickets to?
Yeah. So our work, right, is about empowering voices for equity, making sure that we are as acceptable as possible. And in that, one thing I share with our constituents, I share with our board, I share with the community at large, is that in many ways, we kind of function like a human service organization that leverages theater as its medium, as its conduit for creating its larger mission, right? Which is empowering voices for equity, making a more equitable tomorrow. And so, like many human service organizations, um, we have a heavier reliance on the donor and community support. So, to your point, you talk about 50-50 splits, 60-40 splits, things like that. In our space, historically, you might see something closer to 75-25 split. Because the reality is that if what we are trying to do is generate more revenue so we can serve the community better, our answer can't be, well, let's raise ticket prices, which is also the traditional medium and mode. For what we need to do is we need to say, well, how do we get more people engaged with us? That, somebody who historically maybe has come to X number of free or nearly free events wants to give a $50 donation. You know, that is basically $5 a month? Or how do we get the person who's been giving $5 a month to give $20 a month? And really, at the end of the day, it's now changing the conversation to a point where people are not buying a commodity, a theatrical experience, which is good, valuable, and awesome. But they are part of the actual organization and moving the mission forward, quite literally, the time they experience and all the future times thereafter that they're not the direct recipient.
Explain that to me a little bit.
So again, I think it's embracing that concept of empathy. So at ALT, kind of our key metric that we look at that many other organizations either don't, can't, or haven't thought about looking at is empathy. And how do you really measure that growth? And we have a lot of reasons in our theory of change about why empathy is sort of that crux component for us. But a huge part of that is a component of selflessness, a sense of community, a sense of belonging is inherent in creating that empathy growth. And so, therefore, again, I'm not saying, hey, you give me $70 and you get an A plus theatrical experience tonight. We might say, hey, if you give $50, $100, $1,000, whatever, you might be creating that for somebody else. You might be giving an opportunity where a child who is struggling to be ready statistically for kindergarten has an opportunity to actually get there and be ready. Because unfortunately, again, when you talk about human services, kindergarten readiness is like one of the biggest measurements and landmarks. Because if their child's not ready for kindergarten, unfortunately, all the data says they're more likely to be a high school dropout, they're more likely to end up in prison, they're more likely to this, blah 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 blah, because of kindergarten. So if we can say, hey, yeah, buy your $25, your $40 ticket, your whatever, but also make a gift of $100 or $200 or whatever. Now they're starting to see the ripple effect of saying, the dollar's not for me. The dollar is for somebody else. That is the empathy growth we're talking about. That concept of like, you know, um, you put out the good deed and karma can come back tenfold. But in many ways, we are reliant on people saying it's more than just themselves, that they're really looking to engage with and for with American Legacy Theater.
You're touching on social service. You've said this a couple times. I would argue, tell me if I'm wrong, that couldn't we say that arts organizations really are social service organizations because of the public value that they provide? It's
Yeah,
you're a
yeah,
vehicle, right?
yeah, absolutely, right, exactly. And I would say at the end of the day, right, part of it is language that is the norm in society, right? So to that point, we say we're a human service organization that leverages theater because the average person in society says that, well, no, you're an arts organization. You don't do that stuff, right? And
Yeah.
so there's that. I think the other thing behind it is arts organizations don't talk like that. Now, if arts organizations started talking like that and saying, no, 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 we happen to do art, but we are a human service organization, I would still say that ALT is different. And we would probably come up with another phrase that made us kind of accentuate kind of what makes us unique in that sense. But yes, to your point, I think it's that huge component of the data is there to say that when art is pulled from a people, from a society, from a culture, other really bad things start to happen. I mean, again, like we see something as simple as, you know, student attendance in school go down when art disappears. We see crime rates go up in communities when culture is being pulled out of communities. So I'm totally in
Yeah.
line with you on
Yeah, and I can feel people shudder perhaps when I say that we have to get away from arts for art's sake and that we've painted ourselves in a corner, or sometimes I'll say, we can't package ourselves and put us up on a shelf and just say, we're special and you need to protect us, because that is now biting us in the behind when it comes to public dollars and philanthropic dollars. So I will clarify, my audience outside of the podcast is by and large public officials, lawmakers, policymakers, etc., lobbying for funding for the arts. And I'm not going to go in and talk about how the arts uplift. That's why you should just fund them. I say a bra uplifts, or at least it should, if it's doing its job.
that.
But just to your point, the arts are foundational. Yes, I'm all about reframing the story to resonate. We've been talking about economic impact in the arts for 40 years. There's a big so what in my head when I hear that, because if that really was the impactful story, we wouldn't be fighting for funding
Yeah.
all the time. So now actually I'm going to shift to the funding, and then we'll toggle back and forth
Yeah, that's right.
throughout this 30-minute conversation. So where do you get the majority of your funding? Because if you are social service,
Yep.
but you I mean you're in two lanes or you cross. So do you
Yeah.
get arts council funding? Do you get human service? Explain what that challenge is like.
Yeah, so I think kind of to kind of put a button on what we were talking about before too, is that it's also about the mindset. And I would say the mindset of the leadership, because to your point, this idea of like we can't create art for art's sake exclusively, um, that sometimes, to your point, sends a ripple through the hearts of artistic directors and curators across the country. Whereas my mindset is art is a byproduct of what we're really trying to do, which is workforce development, kindergarten readiness, blah, 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 et cetera, mental health. And so, to that point, that is where our funding comes from. So, for example, I mean, a huge percentage of our funding comes from grants, period, right? And those can be government grants and those can be private foundation grants. I'd say there's two key, like, system wide things that we are working on collectively with a number of other partners that is really accelerating the work of ALT, and ALT is accelerating the work of the community. So, for example, we are currently partnering with Hamilton County Jobs and Family Services. What arts organization is partnering with Job and Family Services? Very, 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 very few, if any. I don't know of any myself, right? And so that is a huge component, because what happens is the work that we are doing, where we're utilizing theater as a medium to drive kindergarten readiness in preschools and, third grade literacy in elementary schools and workforce development in high schools through the lens of students writing, designing, acting in their own original productions around social issues that are critical to them performing for an audience. I mean, it is theater, but again, it's a mindset about why we're doing it. What's happening is they are seeing the data that we've been able to acquire over time. And they're saying that might be one of the missing pieces we have to create our larger goal of erasing intergenerational poverty. And we think this might be a pathway, a part of their own portfolio that will achieve that success. And again, I articulated it in that way because the reality is, I think, in my experience, a lot of artists I've known lots and lots of artists, is that um, sometimes the art itself gets in the way. And what I mean by that is that we as artists believe that our art should be lifted and on a pedestal and this and that. And again, I say yes, and for what reason? And if the reason is for self, that's where we're getting into that space of art for art's sake. When we say, yeah, the art is important and it is a part of this overarching community problem and solution, that's when you can really fire on all cylinders. And actually, in turn, by making yourselves a part of the whole rather than the top of the whole, it actually lifts up the work even more. So I mean, we've got partnerships there. We're partnering with state departments on how do we not only look at reducing stigma around mental health, but actually driving the workforce. Right? We know that there are bottlenecks. There's not enough people going into behavioral health for a workforce, and so we're partnering with state departments to use theater again to drive interests and pipelines into behavioral health, not the arts as the career pathway.
I've struggled a lot with communicating art's impact in
Mm-hmm.
a language that, again, a lawmaker or a corporate leader or a philanthropist can understand. Because we've measured, again, what I say transactionally. How many tickets have you sold? What's your budget size? How many students come through your program? Those are great, but they don't tell the true story that we have countless studies and books written about your brain on art and what music does to your brain and blah, blah, blah. So, in developing this pilot project that will roll out to something bigger that you and I are working on, I spoke with the foundation about supporting this work, and I'm just curious to your reaction to this. And the feedback that I got was, well, we don't have arts organizations coming to us saying that they need tools to help them fundraise. So we're not sure if what you're creating really is needed or important. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, right. So I would say it's a couple of things, right? I mean, we work a lot with youth in our work, right? And one of the things we talk to youth about is sometimes they can't ask the questions because they don't even know that the question could be asked. They don't know that the question should be asked. Or sometimes we, as the teacher, are not empowering them to ask. And so I would argue it's probably very similar in those veins, in those respects. Because again, there's a lot of things at play. One, most foundations across the great land of America and beyond say they only want to fund either brand new things, but not really brand new because we're brand new and they don't want to fund that because we haven't been around long enough because we got to be, yeah. But also, they don't want to fund infrastructure, capacity building, anything that is not directly program, aka, right? I mean, so there's all those things. So I think there's an onus there on foundations, candidly, to say, oops, are we not allowing our partners that we want to support in the community to ask the questions that they really need to ask or to ask for the funding they really need to seek?
What a cool analogy that you just gave me, which is just like a child doesn't know what to ask for or that they're allowed to ask for it. It's a very similar situation. They're not holding that space to allow for those questions to happen. And then secondly, real quick, thing that I say is you're not funding programs, you're funding people. It takes people to put on the programs because the cost to develop a new program, if you had the funding to develop a new program, you wouldn't be in the position that you have to go fund the program that currently exists. Okay,
Exactly.
that's
So
all.
there's that. So the other part
Yeah.
behind it is again in turn is, and I will look to my peers across the sector in the industry, which is, are the artistic directors, are the curators, are the CEOs asking themselves the question of, well, what can we really do better? And I know they are, but again, in this space and in this vein, I know for a fact there are so many people who are incredibly dedicated and dedicate their entire lives to this work and to the art. They're saying, how can we do the art better? How can we do this better? How can we do that better? Are we asking the question of measurement better? And the reality is, in my experience in the conversations I've had, those questions aren't being asked. Partially because, and here's where it becomes cyclical, they are not incentivized to ask those questions because what they're so used to doing is saying, I need to get this. Right? I mean, like personal experience. I just did a sprint, kind of 3 4 week heavy look with my board and some key volunteers and staff around measurements and data gaps. And what we did was we first cataloged everything that we are required to capture for the sake of the funders that we currently get money from. Thank you so much, funders. We're thrilled to get that. But candidly, a lot of what we have to measure is taking up so much of our bandwidth that it's hard for us to even get to the things that we want to measure that are actually indicative of whether our actual theory of change is working. And it is working. But it's one of those things where what we prioritize as most impactful ends up being on the bottom of the prioritization list of what we're measuring because we have to do these other things first. And so until some of our funders also start either asking us what we should be measuring or trusting a little bit more that what we're doing is working and give us time to demonstrate that it's working, we're going to have this conundrum. So again, it's not a this or that. It is a both parties, I think, can and should do and must do better if we're really going to. But I think that those are the components. It's like, are we complacent as arts organizations? Are we complacent and like, well, it's good enough because we're getting the funding? And is it from the funder's perspective of saying, well, are we asking the wrong questions? Should we actually just be asking you what we should be measuring and go from there, right? And it
Yeah.
might be different organization to organization, which is
The
I'm sorry.
accountability, it's the accountability that I don't know why I'm surprised that there are those organizations out there that it is the status quo, this is good enough, we just want the check and we're going to just continue to go on down the road and maybe our program isn't as effective as we think it is, or hey, maybe if you tweak something it could actually impact even more. But if you don't explore that, you don't know that.
Yeah. Well, do you want me to throw out another like bombshell?
Sure.
Okay, great. So, I'll throw out one more bombshell. But again, in the spirit of creating a button for the previous thought, the other
Yeah.
thing is if you look at the macro data of fundraising, there's less and less donors giving, more and more dollars being given, and so that kind of creates a blanket over some things. But if you look at the macro data, arts funding over the years has gone from 5% of philanthropy to about 4 to 3%. So ipso facto, that is a problem. So on the bombshell component that I think needs to be addressed and looked at as well in the space of accountability is most, not all, most arts organizations across our fair land are charitable organizations, 501c3 nonprofits. Most are. And we are at again, I'm going to use a business term here. We are at a competitive disadvantage. We are at a competitive disadvantage by being a nonprofit because you have to deal with not only the stigma of what it means to be a nonprofit, you also have to deal with the legal realities of what it means to be a nonprofit. In that, so many organizations are saying, well, how come you didn't see this coming a mile away? Why weren't you doing enough strategic planning? Why weren't you doing scenario planning? Why weren't you doing this plan and that plan? And, da, 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 da. And here's why. Because nonprofit organizations legally have to utilize all of their dollars in very certain ways. Now, yes, they can reinvest in themselves. They can do this. They can still build some component. And at the same time, if you look at the data, the best absolute gold standard nonprofits across the land have about 6 months of operations in the bank. So that inherent reality of having 6 months in the bank at most for the best organizations further incentivizes nonprofits to live paycheck to paycheck, to put it in layman's terms, right? They are living in a space where they need to know that the next grant, the next donation, the next ticket sale is going to come through the door because they don't have these stockpiles. Because if they did, the whole community would say, "Well, hold on, they're supposed to be a nonprofit. Why are they sitting on all this money that we're giving and we're spending out?" I mean, again, when I first applied for grants, I used to get denied up the wazoo, and people kept saying, "Everything you're saying in the grant is brilliant. We love it. The reason we denied you was because of your budget." And it was one of those things where if I asked for a $10,000 grant, I would show at the end, the organization would net 2,500 bucks in surplus. And they said, "So you don't actually need our money?" I said, "Well, no, because I don't get to the $2,500 surplus until I get to 10K in, right?" But they also were saying, "Yeah, but if you ask for 10K, we want you to net zero at the end." I go, "Well, if I'm netting zero, how am I building capacity for the organization or the program that you're seeking sustainability answers from me on?" And they're like, "Yeah, but that's just the way things are." So again, all of that stigma, all of that systemic reality of nonprofits is also what puts us into that position. And again, skewing over to the human service world, we know that families that are living paycheck to paycheck, like a nonprofit is living paycheck to paycheck, undergo significantly more stress than their counterparts in daily life. And that additional stress actually makes them less capable of doing long term planning, of doing these proactive components, just because it's such a mental health challenge to live in that state of stress. Plus, you are trying to figure out how to keep the lights on, how to do this, how to do that. So, again, all of that stuff we know to be true now, statistically, for people struggling financially. Now we just need to carry that same mindset over to the very organizations that are serving predominantly that same community, is that there's high stress.
So, how do we shift or change that thinking? Can we? Or is the monster too big?
We must change it. And I think when we stop believing that the change can happen, that's when we also need to ask ourselves the question of like, are we in the right seat? Because sometimes you want the people who are leading the charge to be the ones who believe the possibility the most, right? That's like what you read interviews with Eisenhower, and they said, "Well, what made you the 5-star general that you were?" And he said, "Well, I believed what I was selling." He goes, and I got other people to believe it. He goes, the day I walked in and said, "I don't believe what I'm saying anymore," he's like, "That's when I got out of the military. I got out of politics." Like, he stopped being a leader because he was like, "I can't, if I'm not buying it, then how do I expect other people to? So I think there's that. But I would also say that part of it is the other half of your audience is helping people understand that the questions that people are asking are good questions. There's just more questions that create more nuance answers that could be asked. So again, to that point of we deal with funders all the time or supporters or donors, and they say, why is it that for, if I give you $5,000, you say you're going to reach and impact the lives of 20 children, and we give $5,000 to somebody else, and they say they can reach 50,000 kids with the same money. And I said, well, one, there's a difference between impact and reach. There's also a difference between the kind of impact we're both doing. Both are impactful, but for different reasons, right? Because the organization, I would gather to say, the organization that says we can reach 50,000 kids and $5,000 is they've got a massive theater and children are getting bussed in and paying $10 or $15 a piece to see a show. And it's great. It's wonderful. Some of those kids are seeing it for the first time. It needs to happen. What we're doing is we're doing two, like two teaching artists to 20 students with a third teacher in the room. So you got what, 3 to 20 ratios? That's what, almost one to six, 1 to 7. And we're with students for 20 hours, not only helping them build a production, manage a budget, present it to a public. In the for-profit world, we would call that a product launch. They're doing all of that, but they're also becoming better people along the way. And that's only because we're able to put in that time and effort and things like that. Now, if you say another organization is doing that amount of work and they're 10 times more efficient, then I say, great. Can you connect me with them so I can learn how to become more efficient too? Because right now, this is what we've been able to succeed and achieve. And so that's reality. You can't compare, one of 200 people or one of 300 people in a show to 20 hours of base, almost 1 to 6 hands-on instruction that is customized to those students specifically.
Is it difficult to tell your story?
Absolutely. Because it's different. It's a completely, and so here's the thing. I once built a chart that said, this is how American Legacy Theater is different, and this is what we do differently. And if we weren't, and I think it's the double pronged change that makes it particularly difficult. If we were saying, hey, use theater this way, but we believe theater is exactly the way everyone else believes theater is, or if we said, hey, you know what? If you look at theater, we really look at the way theater is. Like, picture theater in your mind, right? What are some of the images that are coming into your mind when you think of theater?
You're asking me. Seats, a curtain, chandelier on the ceiling, a concession stand.
Great. Awesome. Let's go with that. And I would say most people would probably say very similar things: seats, curtain, chandelier, concession stand. I would argue that that is one way of doing theater, not the way of doing theater. And in fact, I would say if you think about a circle having 360 degrees, what we believe theater is 1 degree. ALT is trying to explore the other 359, right? So if you're doing one of those things, it might be easier to explain what the heck we're doing. But we're saying, hey, we're exploring these 359 other degrees, and how we are going to do it and why we are going to do it is also totally different. And so you've got a lot of turbulence that candidly makes it harder for people to grab on. And we know that. And so what we're trying to do is try to find bite-sized pieces. How do we segment a message to say, okay, for those who grab onto the why, for those who grab onto the how, for those who grab onto the what, can we get you to grab on? Can we get you to on the plane for one of those three things? And once you're on the plane, we'll play an in-flight movie, and hopefully you'll learn about the other two as you experience it. So when we talk about building, right, they talk about flying the plane as you're building it, or building the plane as you're flying it, whichever one you want to say. We're doing that too, but we're intentionally doing it with community members rather than for the community members. Let me articulate it this way. In my seat as the artistic director, right? Many people who have the privilege of having a comparable seat in an organization have a very daunting task, right? Many organizations, not so much ours, many other organizations are trying to come up with seasons or, curatorial expositions or whatever. And the artistic director is putting so much weight on their own shoulders to come up with like the magic solution of like what is it that people are going to buy tickets to? What's going to be artistically fulfilling? What's this? What's that? Blah 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 blah. I'm not that smart, so I don't do it that way. The way I do it, the way we do it at American Legacy Theater, is through action-based research. We just ask the community point blank, what are the issues? What are the themes? What are the ideas that you want us to address? Like a focus group in the for-profit world. What do you want us to address? What are you ready to actually engage in to maybe create systemic change? They tell us. From there, it is my job as the artistic director to say, okay, this one got the most votes. And therefore, I need to come up with a theatrical experience, one way or another, that allows the audiences and the people and the community members to come together to experience this so they can be activated to make an improvement in our society.
So that's great. And what I'm hearing or what I received from that was you're actually also lowering, it's the wrong phrase. You are leveling the playing field, meaning you're not this like, hey, we're elitist, we know best, we know what artistic excellence, whatever is. And so here you are. You're having a dialogue with community saying what's resonating with you right now. And you're taking that in and you're executing on that under your brand. Do you like this? Which gets me to the importance of brand. And you just recently rebranded.
Yeah.
What is a brand in performing arts, and how do you know when it's time to refresh or rebrand, or again, where does that fall in the whole strategic plan?
Sometimes people talk about working smarter and not working harder. If the brand is forcing you to work harder and not allowing you to work smarter, that's when you really need to ask yourself that big question. To the point of, American Legacy Theater, we know we're new, we know we're different, we know we are really looking to be acknowledged as this industry disruptor that we are. Disruptor in a good way, not in a chaotic way. But it's one of those things where people are grabbing onto what we're doing. They're like, okay, yeah, I get it. I get it. I get it. And then they keep going up. They're like, so, but why this name or why this look or why this? Or I still have this question. And it's like, well, that should have been addressed in the first 5 seconds, not after a 30-minute conversation. And so we asked people point blank, people we knew and people we didn't know. We showed them our brand, our logo, our image, we showed them pictures, we showed them this, and we said, what do you think American Legacy Theater is based off of what you're seeing? And about half the people were spot on. And then the other half said, it looks like it would be something that focuses on like American Golden Age work. They want to do older shows and they want to like maintain what has been. And that's all I needed to hear. And I said, no, we're not trying to maintain. We are trying to change. Absolutely, we're trying to change.
So touch a little bit on the concept and where it came from of American Legacy Theater.
I remember sitting in my mentor's office, my third year of college, and I said, look, I feel like I'm wasting my life. And he says, well, why? I said, well, simply because I hate theater. And he was like, well, that's a lot. If you have the perspective of we are trying to serve all, create a space where all Americans have access to the empathy art building form of theater and a respected voice in the room where it happens, then that ensures that you're actually pursuing it, whether you're here in Cincinnati, Ohio, or whether you're in Cleveland, Minneapolis, or fill in the blank, Arkansas. Right? I mean, the town of no name. If we're trying to reach all, we're trying to reach all. And I think that's where the name and the legacy to come comes from.
That's awesome. Okay, I could talk to you forever, but in the time allotted, it's time to close. I'm going to end with one question that I've been asking everyone, which is what color do you love the most and why?
Great question. So again, I would say historically, my favorite color has always been blue growing up. but I'm disclaiming and changing my answer because I was enlightened by my 4-year-old son about 3 months ago. And I was asking him, I said, Judah, what's your favorite color?
What's
No
his name?
question. Judah.
Judah. Okay.
And he goes, no question, rainbow. And I said, well, yeah, okay, great. I go, but which color within the rainbow is your favorite color? And he looks out the window and he says, well, Daddy, rainbow is just changed light. He goes, which is clear, and it's made up of all the colors. So one rainbow is my favorite color. And that boy just hit me with philosophy and physics and everything in between in that one comment. And I was just like, you're right. And I think that further articulates, again, the mindset of openness, of acknowledgement that we have so much to learn from the most unsuspecting places that continues to drive me and our organization and hopefully our entire community forward.
That's awesome. And I often feel silly asking that question because it's like, okay, great. What's your favorite color? How profound. But I have come to find that not everyone, but I get an answer that is something that comes out of an area that I never thought of that is so philosophical or so meaningful, or even to see how people respond to that question as adults,
Yeah.
which has been a really cool journey. So yes, you're Judah, right on. I think I'm gonna rethink my favorite color of green as rainbow. I love it. Matthew, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Angela.
That's a wrap for this episode of Arts Redefined. I'm your host, Angela Meleca. Thank you for joining us on this journey to revolutionize the impact of the arts. Your engagement is not just appreciated, it's powerful. Knowing you've made it to the end of today's conversation, we'd appreciate your support by sharing the podcast with fellow art leaders and advocates. Your actions help us spread the message to more people. Together, we can elevate the arts and create meaningful change. Join us next week for more inspiring conversations and actionable insights. And as always, keep redefining the arts.